Okay, the recording has started, so I'll take that as my sign to get going. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Hanne Wagner. I'm a lecturer at Edinburgh Napier University, and I'll be the chair for this wonderful panel. So welcome to this Historical Games Network panel on memory. Before we get going, I would quickly like to say thank you to the Edinburgh Napier University for supporting this event. And so what will be this afternoon about? As I mentioned, we are focusing on memory. So what is the role of memory in, of, and around historical games? What can games do with memory, for example, as a mechanic or plot device or narrative frames? So we're interested in memory in games, but also memory of games. So, for example, how do games engage and intersect with the wider memory industry, institutions, and practices? Can games be an effective container for commemorative and remembrance activities? At the same time, games, well, are global industry, really, aren't they? So what do we do if, for example, remembrance practices differ widely based on varied interpretations of history? What are the tensions that exist potentially between games as purely entertainment and games as experience when dealing with different accounts of the past? Also, what about the people and the things that are forgotten potentially in the production and development of games, and what deals with past and the public and with memories? Apologies for so these are all the issues and the questions we would like to discuss in this afternoon. And so it is my pleasure to introduce our panelists today. Just quickly getting my notes. We have Casilda de Zulueta. I'm completely butchering your name, so apologies. She is a freelancer, technical artist, an animator, indie developer, and animation teacher. Originally a native from Valencia, one of the three capitals of the Spanish Republic, Second Spanish Republic, I should say. She moved to Germany to obtain a master's degree in games development and research at the Cologne Games Lab, with the intentions of making games not only for a living, but also as a means of creative expressions. It was during this time when she first made the first iteration of Tres Rosas, a historical horror adventure game for mobile phones about the Spanish Civil War. We have Dr. Kate Marrison. Kate is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Weidenfeld Institute of German Jewish Studies at the University of Sussex, where she's currently leading the Sussex Digital Holocaust Education Project and is working on the ESRC-funded project co-creating recommendations for digital interventions in Holocaust memory and education, as well as the HEIF-funded Dealing with Digital Heritage projects. Her research interest is primarily focused on digital memory practice, education, and moderation, as it emerges at the intersection between Holocaust studies and media theory. And finally, last but not least, we have Ian Kikuchi, who is a historian and curator at the Imperial War Museum. From 2011 to 2014, he worked on the museum's First World War galleries, and since then has curated a number of exhibitions, including Churchill and the Middle East, as well as Reel to Reel, a century of war movies. In 2016, he proposed War Games, an exhibition on war and video games, opening in 2022 due to this little thing called pandemic in between. At the Imperial War Museum in London, War Games explored how video games tell stories of war and conflict. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Now, before we get going with some discussion, I'd just like to point out for the audience, we're going to have a question and answer section after the main panel. However, you can already type your questions in the chat, and which you should have access to, I hope, in the meantime. And we'll come back to your questions later on. So thank you. Okay. So to begin with, I think it would be good just to start with games, well, and memory in general, and what do games do with memories as a mechanic, a plot device, or a narrative frame. Where do you think games are particularly effective for this, and maybe even more effective, say, than other media types? Who would like to start? Ian, maybe?
It's such a broad question. I'm struck as to where to start. Really, I mean, from my own background, I'm speaking as a curator at the Imperial War Museum. It's very striking the way that the history of war and conflict gets told in very particular ways, in very selective ways, in very narrow ways. So you mentioned in my bio my introduction, the War Games exhibition, and but occasionally when I was working on that exhibition, I would ask myself, if somebody's entire knowledge of, say, the Second World War came from video games, what would you think that war was about? And you would think it was either about close combat or about high command. You might be aware of a genocide somewhere, but it wouldn't matter very much or be terribly important. It would be a male experience. It would be a young male experience. It would be a very muscular young male experience. And there'd be great swathes of the historical reality of the Second World War that would never feature or never cross your mind, because there simply haven't been compelling games made about them. I think games are a fascinating medium for expressing our shared memories of historical periods, because they, on the one hand, their makers are often share those shared cultural impressions, and so they get absorbed and reproduced either deliberately or more subversively. But also because they are, at least because video games are a more participative medium than literature or film, at least notionally they give us the idea, they give us the chance to play with and to make different choices and to actually rewrite those memories a little bit. Of course, I was asked to write a blog post for this piece, and I did wonder about the beginning that the worst thing about memory in historical games is that the historical games are getting bigger and bigger and they take more and more memory. But that's probably about as far as a joke I can get on that subject. But I'll see what our other panelists think.
Okay, please.
Yeah, I mean, just to pick up from what Ian said, particularly on the kind of participatory function of games, and also the second area of your question, which was, how is this a particularly effective medium which other media might struggle to do? And I think the idea is interesting because there's this kind of demand for responsiveness. And I think actually, by virtue of what a game is, being a rule-based environment, or kind of, we have to execute an algorithm, I think actually that we're kind of implicated into this in a much more substantial way to ways in which other medium, I mean, Ian mentioned books and films, but even just other digital media, there's not always such a tendency to implicate us, even at the kind of level of touching or pressing a button or doing something. And I think actually there we're being kind of, implicated in this memory production in a way which can be more affective and effective than other formats. But yeah, that was just the second half of the question. I'm still thinking on the first.
Thank you. Cassie, would you like to add something? I can't hear you right now. Maybe
sorry,
me.
no.
On green.
I didn't unmute myself. If you see me red, is that I cannot speak anymore. The thing that games can do with memory is something tricky, because when we think of the nature of games in contrast with other media is the level of interaction. I'm not talking about immersion, because you can be completely immersed in literature. That is something that doesn't have to do with how much visual realism is expressed in the image, but it's more so in itself. Games, what gives you that other media doesn't, is the option of being participative of the experience. And maybe that is also something very tricky, especially with memory of something as present as the 20th century, which is still on our shoulders, and to some countries more pervasive than to others. But that is like walking down the the line, the rope between giving the players the opportunity to maybe change history, or actually teaching history that you so much need to research and ask experts on the matter. And maybe there's maybe another opportunity for talking later more about the responsibilities of the source material that you're working with as a developer. But that is one thing. The other is that the other media struggle to have this nuance of the viewer or the reader is part of the activity. So I'm thinking that there's other kind of films that are very conscious about the audience that is looking at the film. I'm thinking of Haneke, for example. But in games have another problem in general, which is that they are seeing history constantly through other entertainment media and making very more often than not very superficial depictions of history, of memory, and especially when it comes to the struggles of war. Maybe because they have to reduce mechanic wise, but also it affects the plot, the history, the textual message of those titles. That is my opinion, and that is something also that is very fragile in the way I'm trying to design this game as well. Yeah.
Thank you. So sorry, because you just mentioned your own game. So what was your approach to memory, if that's okay to do a quick tangent then?
Yeah, well, first, you cannot change history. That your presence as a player is more of a discoverer of the things that happened in the past, and probably trying to understand the reason behind those events. It is about the Spanish Civil War. It's a war that has everything and nothing to do with the Second World War. But I cannot imagine myself touching the severity of those topics without the distancing, not only of myself as the teller, but the player themselves cannot be a person of action of the past, but someone that is remembering and making an action of remembrance through playing the game. Yeah, maybe there are different endings, but those endings don't change the history, which is something that happens and we have documentation for. Although there are many ways of reading history, but that's another level of complication on top of that. But at least, like, yeah, that level of fiction cannot be trespassed if you want to still call it a historical game, I think.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm looking back to our other two panelists.
Well, I was struck, Cassie, as you were speaking, that one of the games that featured in my exhibition was Paint Bucket Games' Through the Darkest of Times, which was a kind of strategy game set in the Third Reich before the Second World War. And again, speaking to the developers of that title, they were very conscious that allowing the player to come up with to effectively write some alternative history in which Hitler gets assassinated and liberal democracy reigns and the Holocaust doesn't happen is somehow distasteful and disrespectful to the reality of what happened. And so in their case, the focus of the game is on kind of token acts of resistance and of protecting the people who are resisting with you. Knowing even while that you're not going to be able to change the grand arcing historical narrative. I mean, on the subject of memory in historical games, I'm also struck by the case of another game that featured in our exhibition, which was 1111 Memories Retold, a game that came out in 2018. Aardman Animations and Digix Art's kind of First World War kind of interactive narrative, and the very, if you ever see a trailer for it or play it, you'll be very struck by its visual. It's a kind of a painting. It's presented like a painting which constantly shifts, and that, to me, is a very neat little analogy, really, because the scene is somehow fluid and intangible and ethereal, and it moves as you move through it, and that, I think, is a quite nice metaphor actually for our memories. The First World War, 1111 is set in the First World War. The First World War is now lost to us. It's gone. It's beyond living memory. I imagine the Spanish Civil War, Cassie, must be quite close to the edge of living memory, if not already. I mean, how many witnesses still survived the Spanish Civil War? I wonder. Some, any? I don't know. Maybe young children.
Children at this point.
Yeah, but I think there's a, because on the one hand, there's this. I think making games are a creative outlet, and they will be, and they're a form of storytelling, and they permit stories to be told in whatever terms you want them, but they are this. I think somehow there is a role, I think, of our collective memories in framing or shaping or setting the parameters of the discussion, and I think that comes up also against the question of play. I don't know how fun you intend your Spanish Civil War game to be, or what fun means to you in terms of gameplay. But it's one of those things which, some war games are quite happy for their war to be a rip-roaring adventure, and other games, your war is a traumatizing thing that you want to end as quickly as possible. So I think there's just a great deal. I think a great deal to be said about the way that our memory kind of parameters off things that can be done and things that we let players do in games.
Yeah, I think, going to the farther extreme of being cathartic, creating a cathartic experience in which you change history, at least you should be very conscious that you are doing this, and this is not what actually happened, but like giving you a vengeance pleasure for once, and making sure that the fascists didn't win in Spain, things like that. But that's a choice that I didn't follow, because in my context, or at least that's how I'm seeing it, I need my audience, or the general audience, to understand first that the fascists were the bad ones, and that it wasn't good that they won, and that it wasn't good that we had almost 40 years of dictatorship and a very very under the rug transition towards democracy. So before I can be all sarcastic and fantastic, and I love those slasher depictions of violence in games as well. I think I need, at least for myself, to first do the serious thing, although this is not a serious game, but like a little bit of not playing with irony yet, and then continue with the others, because everybody knows that Hitler was a bad guy, and if somebody doesn't agree, then they shouldn't be in this call, right? But it's not that easy to say that in Spain, unfortunately.
I think as well, I think you said, parameters of discussion, Ian, and it made me think that actually sometimes even game designers and developers and the press that surrounds certain games isn't always clear what memory is being told, or there's memories within memories. And it kind of brings us back, I think, to like Call of Duty World War II, which I know I've harped on about a lot in various other forums. So I don't want to bore anyone, we're all bored to death, but I think there was this kind of, idea that it wasn't going to, and I quote, shy away from history. And there was this kind of backlash against it, that it didn't depict the Holocaust, when actually those that have played the game knows that it depicts the story of American POWs who went to Bergen labor camp. But it's confused with this kind of epilogue where you seemingly liberate a concentration or extermination camp. And so you kind of have these memories, even within the kind of narrative that surrounds the game, which is confused. So I think it's interesting when we talk about, yeah, how we're using memory in games, but also the kind of extra textual thing that's happening outside of it. I was just thinking of how you said, yeah, parameters of discussion, and how actually, yeah, it wasn't very clear what was going on.
What strikes me about what you've just said is that kind of in a way, I think we're seeing the video games as a medium seem to be what's the word, maturing quite rapidly. You know, having had, I mean, they're about 50 odd years now in video game history, more or less, unless you go right back to the very beginnings of the first things you could play with a computer. But 50 odd years or so of video games, I think we've gone through. I mean, I find the comparison actually quite fascinating with cinema. You know, cinema went through its exploitation phase and its kind of anything goes phase in different periods. Now, video games, possibly now because they're aspiring to be high art and literature, feel like they have to behave more, what's the word, responsibly or more ethically, or think more deeply about the choices that they make. And maybe that's all to the good. But occasionally that means you get a massive mega franchise like Call of Duty saying, making out that they're not just a roller coaster with loads of guns set in World War II. And I find that, I hope there's nobody from Activision on the call, but we'll find out. But it's, and I don't get me wrong, I enjoy the games very much, but I think there's while there is, I think, some obligation on developers to handle their material carefully, there comes a point where it starts feeling a little bit po-faced, or a little bit, it seems to get away from what we're actually talking about. We're not talking about art films here, or possibly I'm expressing the tension just myself. There's an tension that exists between video games becoming this serious artistic medium and remaining. I mean, weirdly, gaming remains a kind of subcultural activity, even though it's bigger than cinema and music and everything else put together in the world. Quite how that's managed to happen, I don't quite understand. But still, I think there is a tension there.
Yeah, and I mean, this probably will come up in other questions that we'll talk about, but I think there's this tension now between this term serious games, what that means, and the language we're using around it. And I interviewed Marcus Basserman for my contribution to the blog, which will be there soon, about this, and he was talking about exactly that really, how suddenly, we might have to describe comics as graphic novels, and our games actually going that way, where suddenly they have to become this higher form, and we won't call a game a game. It will become
fiction.
Yeah, it reminds me of that actually.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I think we will come back to this topic in a little while. But thank you so much, everyone, so far. Now, unless you feel like you want to continue in this thread of thought, I would like to move our discussion a little bit to issue of commemoration and remembrance through games in games. Do you think games are a good medium for that? Is it an effective medium? Please, sorry.
Well, I was thinking about this question, and I don't have in mind a particularly good example of games being used explicitly for commemorative practice, or for the purpose of commemoration. I think it seems, I mean, looking at the games, for example, that came out during the First World War centenary period, there seems to be a kind of, it's not quite commemoration because it's not about remembering real people, but there seems to be a certain amount of binding up in that, the reverence and sort of sensitivity that parts of the First World War story get dealt with are not really present in the Second World War at all. There's a kind of different approach there entirely. In terms of commemorative practices in games themselves, I mean, I can well imagine any kind of social video game being used by groups of people as a commemorative space. Whether that's any large online game is a place where people gather. I can imagine people holding wakes, or memorial services. I mean, I'm sure this stuff is already happening. And that seems to me to be perfectly proper, and is really just a manifestation of existing practices in a virtual space. And it seems also quite common actually to commemorate people, to commemorate people in digital spaces where you've had your if a friend passes away, it's maybe not uncommon to remember them in a particular place in whichever virtual world you prefer to inhabit. I mean, I'm struck also by examples where actually video games have attempted to use the visual language of commemoration and remembrance, at least in the UK, and got themselves into massive amounts of hot water. Like back in the 90s, there was the case of Cannon Fodder by Sensible Software, which used poppies, and every time one of your player characters got killed, they were commemorated by name, and a little headstone would appear on a hillside between levels. And they released, I think, just before Armistice Day, just before Remembrance Sunday in 1992, and got it right in the neck from the tabloid press, who thought this was a dreadful, to co-opt the symbol of the poppy for some trivial video game was considered completely outrageous, when the purpose of that game was to be satirical. And when you read it as a satire, it's all completely obvious that it's a satire, and it's actually quite a very thoughtful and sensitive satire. So yeah, I mean, I think there is commemoration is one of those things which butts games, the supposed frivolity or unseriousness of games right up against things which are very, very precious and very, very personal. And I think it's likely we'll see those kinds of things play out and evolve, quite naturally as people get more used to spending more time in virtual spaces.
Thank you, Ian. Kate, do you want to?
Yeah, I can feed in. It's a slightly different angle on it, but the idea of can games be a vessel for commemoration? It makes me think of a particular case study. We've been working with Jar Harel. He's a game designer in Berlin, and he decided many years ago that he wanted to make a computer game about his grandmother's experiences during the Holocaust. And this was kind of met by his family with kind of complete shock and anger, and they were not sure about it, and they were kind of there was a lot of trepidation around this, and it actually led to him sort of, I guess, with growing momentum, decided to go ahead and do it anyway. And there was a film subsequently made about it called Panelists, The Heart of the Matter. But what really struck me as important about that process is that the whole game design and development was actually what was the vessel for commemoration, regardless of the kind of digital asset that came out at the end, regardless of whether the game was made or not. The whole process for him turned into this kind of intergenerational familial return. Him and his dad ended up going back to Poland and visiting the camp in which his grandmother was. And it really kind of opened up dialogue between the family about actually what had gone on. And previously there were kind of these secrets and this kind of hidden memory. And if it wasn't for the game being so provocative in the first place and kind of, prompting people into kind of action, then that memory practice and that memory discourse couldn't have took place. So in a way, that's, I think, an example of how games can be a vessel for commemoration and practice without actually having the game. Of course, hopefully there will be a game, but that's to say that actually all these years later, the game is still in development, but all of this kind of productive memory practice has since occurred. So I think that's just, an interesting kind of take on the question.
Yeah, thank you. Please.
I didn't come here to talk about my game, but I have to talk about how people reacted when I was explaining to different generations that I was making a game with such topic, and taking the figure of the 13 Roses, who were 13 women in the Unified Socialist youth in Spain that got executed after the war had ended. So they were kind of a martyr symbol. I mean, they were used for exemplified capital penalty, but it ended up being that symbol as well, turned around, as in they resisted until the very end, and even when the war ended, it was over for them, but not the memory. And even one of them wrote as her last letter, "Do not let history too forget my name." And I'm not, so again, with the sensibility of it, I'm not recreating their lives and how they ended in prison and all of that kind of stuff. The information is going to be there in one of the areas of the final game. But the thing that I wanted to talk about is how, when I started with, I'm making a game about the Spanish Civil War, got the attention of people that were very conscious about our past and know way more than me. The eyebrows raised and were dubious about how gentle the treatment could be in this medium, because the very few things that they knew about games was that the first affordance of a game is to shoot. And then when I explained to them, no, you don't shoot around, you just go around this house and find notes and have to explore and have to understand what's going on, and then you solve puzzles and look, this is and I'm adding symbols of the resistance. I'm adding what could be a virtual memorial to the lack of bigger ones, like in Germany. I hate making comparisons, but I live in a country that every single corner of it is remembering architectonically with the golden stones. These are projects that did not start until this century in Spain, even though Franco died in 1975. So yeah, it can, but you have to also own I think they can serve as a commemoration and remembrance activity. I really like the idea, and I've seen effects of social games being used as well as places for commemoration. But when you are the one creating the game, it is important that you also own the language around the discourse around what you are making. It is a game, but it is not a game in which you shoot people. It is a game in which you have to understand history in order to continue advancing in a simplified way, because if it were only that, it would be a very boring game. I'm sorry. Yeah, so yes.
You. So I'm thinking of what both you and Kate just said. So would you say that maybe how we treat memories in games could also be a reflection of how society at large handled certain things? Or do you think it's more down to the individual, especially if it's a smaller game? Or maybe, well, what about bigger, studios handling things like that? Does that make sense?
Wait, did you say my name? I thought you said Kate.
It's general in the apologies, in the round.
I guess I don't know if this is really getting to your question at all, but just while the other panelists are thinking of better answers than mine, I think there's Paint Bucket was already brought up in this discussion, and I think maybe there's something to the idea that these indie studios are taking a very sort of nuanced and micro history approach to a lot of these games. I'm thinking also of Charles Games, a Prague-based indie studio that produced a lot of games also around the Holocaust. Sorry, I know this is the theme I keep bringing up because it's what I know, but yeah, and I think actually maybe when you go to these kind of micro histories or you're kind of putting memories of war in certain specific contexts of what happened in a year in a place in a certain situation, it seems like these types of games are at least being critically applauded, rather than taking on this kind of, we're going to cover the whole war in, I don't know, 10 levels, and you're going to advance all of this terrain and do all these different things. I think I've seen a trend, at least in the kind of, I guess, institutional, professional landscape of these types of games, yeah, taking on maybe micro histories. I don't know if that opens up any sort of conversation from that question.
I think inevitably any subject which has the potential to be politically sensitive or socially sensitive, the bigger the company, often I think the less desire there is to get into the teeth of that. I think that's possibly in the nature of commercial entertainment. You know, the bigger you get, possibly the more risk averse you get. So I'm very sorry, Hannah. I forgot the rest of your question. Could you give it to us again?
Sorry, I know it was just an in-between question. I was just reflecting on what Cassie and Kate said, how maybe, well, I was just wondering out loud more how basically the treatment of certain memories, maybe it's in games, and the fact that certain things are actually, well, portrayed in games now, could be also be a reflection on society at large, or whether it's more down to the individual developer or studio. But again, don't worry too much.
No, I mean, I wonder. The cynic in me would wonder whether implementing or permitting things or encouraging that kind of thing is a shortcut to seeming deep and meaningful. But that's possibly me allowing my cynical side out a bit more than I should.
Well, if anything, it would be a wonderful, what's the word? I'm completely blanking. Wonderful, just what you need when you're sharing. But link to my next question, if you're okay with moving on. Because as we mentioned before, there is this tension as games as entertainment versus games as potentially an experience, or if you're talking serious games or educational games. So yeah, what do you think of the tension that exists between these two different kinds of games, and especially when thinking about, well, how we remember and maybe slightly different accounts of what happened, and what roles would games have in that case? Kind of, is it to facilitate between different ways of remembering potentially and what is remembered, but also being there for entertainment versus potentially being more there for education or as a general experience?
I mean, there was a moment, there was a point you raised there, Hannah, about about the challenges of different perspectives. I'm struck that one of IWM's temporary exhibitions at the moment is about the Northern Ireland Troubles, and that historical subject matter is not my area of expertise, so I'll avoid commenting on it directly. But one thing that has come out in my colleagues' curatorial practice developing that show is that there are very often multiple directly contradictory overlapping narratives of the same events, and it's now difficult or possibly it may be impossible to come up with a single narrative which both sides or both parties to a conflict could agree was true and historically actual. I mean, it's tempting to imagine that because video games can allow you to jump perspective, to take the other side, to move around a scene, to pause action, to explore a space in 3 dimensions, that maybe a video game based treatment of a very complex subject, might allow you to perceive things from the other side or to see things a little bit differently. But equally, I can imagine it being paralyzingly difficult to actually execute that in such a way that genuinely gave you that freedom of perspective, because inevitably you bring some baggage to it. I mean, I don't feel that I have a great investment in that particular story, but I'm a British citizen, for instance. At least notionally, I'm on one side rather than the other. If I were an Irish citizen, doubtless I would feel slightly differently, or it would be slightly closer to home. So I think it's an interesting one. And your point also about games as entertainment versus games as experiences, or possibly educational experiences. It is a certain degree of baggage about games being frivolous and fun, and I think a game can be entirely worthwhile and be nothing but thought-provoking all the way through. I remember one of the games featured in my exhibition was Bury Me, My Love, a mobile game based around the experiences of a Syrian refugee trying to make the journey to Europe. And the entire game plays out as if through a text messaging app like WhatsApp. And when the story ends, and there are 30 or so different endings that the not your player character, but the person with whom you're notionally interacting, your wife character who's making the journey to Europe, 30 different ways this story can end. And my story ended with her dying of hypothermia, having failed to cross a river. And that ending was played out to me in a voice note, from this character. And I don't think I'll ever forget sitting there thinking, bloody hell, I've failed. I've absolutely catastrophically failed in this thing, and I can't say I was enjoying myself. But that game made its point incredibly powerfully. So, I think if you can liberate yourself a little bit from the baggage that attends the word game, then all kinds of rich experiences are possible if they're executed with skill.
Yeah, I think to follow on from that, Ian, and to actually go back to something that was mentioned in the bio introduction, me and my colleague Victoria Grace Walden have been leading the co-designing guidelines for digital interventions in Holocaust memory and education project, which is a bit of a mouthful. But in that project, we spoke to lots of game developers, academics, creative practitioners. And one of the key things we said, we kind of asked them was, what do you think is this tension between entertainment and games and experiences? And I think the kind of consensus was actually that we need a new language, or we need to change a lot of the kind of sector's understanding of what even play means. What do we mean by a game, and this is where I come back to this idea of what a serious game is, and whether that's actually also kind of ring fencing what we might now be moving into these kind of sophisticated serious games or not. But yeah, I think actually this might be a problem with language, particularly around kind of memory institutions feeling trepidation about getting into games as a form of media that they might want to present different memories through. So yeah, I think actually it might, rather than kind of being an inherent tension in the media, I think it might be the language and the discourse that we're having around it that might need to change.
Thank
It
you.
also seems that it's different venues of capital in order to define what is more important, what should be more important in the development of something, if it's entertainment qualities or if it's first and foremost trying to become an educational project. The thing is that games alone to me are not like any media in itself, like without the educational context and without the teachers to be there and explain you the context and all the gaps that the piece of media did not cover because they didn't want to, they didn't have time. It was a feature that was never thought of. So serious games has the label itself gives you the impression of seriousness. Allow me to repeat myself, but like it means therefore that you can apply for certain kinds of funding in order to continue making your project, even though maybe no matter if you're doing mainly entertainment stuff or something a little bit with a more delicate tone and like not so explosive, it will mean other things, right? So it's more a matter of what is sometimes it feels like what is the economical context in which this game is going to be developed, that it will either become an entertainment piece of media or a serious experience. And I think indie games are exploring that much more than the bigger ones, also because of the need for being conservative in what the big budget things try to explore in order to not fail. But on the other hand, because it's just indies will need other sources of income, and their experience would be categorized in wherever the publisher wants, for as long as they can get some funding from it. I think that is from the development perspective that is crucial in order to decide to define how you are talking about your game. And I don't want to call my game serious, but if it means that European cultural heritage something wants to give me some money for it, I will not say no. Because I will continue taking seriously the topic, right? But I'm not making a serious game as an instruction on how to perceive history the same way that you are teaching firefighters in a VR. That is a serious game, right? It's a tool that is teaching you how to effectively do your work. And this doesn't go well together. But if it's still the word that will give you that will open you certain doors for continuing your project and your ideas, then you roll with that. I think.
Thank you. A very, very practical approach.
It's a very practical approach.
Great, and Ian, would you like to add anything to this discussion?
I think if I was going to it, probably just echo what I've already said, but I think I guess I hope that heritage institutions won't require designers to call their games serious because we're going to get over this at some point, you know. And I think, again, when I was speaking to Marcus recently in the interview, he was saying, you know, it's the Landecker Foundation also working with Paint Bucket on a game called Remember the Children of Bullenhauser Down. And they were talking about this genre, you know, maybe there's this new genre of digital remembrance game, and maybe that's easier for us to swallow than this idea of serious games. I don't know. But a lot of the people that we've actually spoken to in our field about this, no one likes this term serious games. And it seems like even in this forum, people are a bit not so, you know, it's not in favor. So yeah, what would be better rather than forcing the kind of back end of people describing it to get money is that heritage institutions don't feel like they have to write it in the bid at the start. And again, I think we've got a long way to go before we get there probably, but yeah. No,
I would echo, I think the language, I think it's absolutely right to point out the problem with the language because it's such an obstacle. I remember talking about my exhibition to colleagues at the Imperial Museum, you know, just saying that you want to do something about video games. There was, at least amongst people who don't play video games regularly, there was an assumption this would be nothing but shooters, nothing but meaningless violence, you know, a certain amount of hand-wringing about, you know, is this really something we should be doing? And it kind of, you know, the word game and gaming and all the, you know, we all live in the aftermath of the moral panic of, you know, video games being as corrupting to the young as, you know, Pulp Fiction and novels and everything else that's occasionally corrupting the young at whatever point in time you live in. And yet the shadow of that casts on, I think, hugely socially useful project is really quite deep, I think. And yeah, I think if there is some leverage one could bring to bear to shedding the connotations of the word games and gaming, then so much to the better, really.
Great. Thank you. Now, I'm aware we are running very quickly out of time for the main panel, but maybe really briefly, one final question, if that's all right with everyone. As I mentioned before, well, what about the things and the people that are forgotten in the production or development of games that deal with past or public memory? Who do you think, or what I should say, is currently usually being left out of our true of memory in games? And might there be a way to include them, or how, if at all?
Well, I think I mentioned some of them in my first contribution. I think inevitably, you know, there is the fact that games are a participant media biases them towards action, towards agency, and that tends to lead you towards ever more wild acts of, you know, superheroic agency. You know, I was. And that inevitably, the knock-on effect of that is that you tend to tell male stories, you tend to tell stories of young men, you tend to tell stories of violence and combat, you tend to tell stories of adventure or high command, so you don't tell the stories of the old, the young, of people doing non-combatant work, of people doing, you know, civilian war work, of people who are of generations that come after, of countries or peoples that are not directly participant in, or party to a conflict. You know, my first major piece of work for the Imperial War Museum was cataloguing then referred to as the Far Eastern, but we would now call Southeast Asian, you know, film collection from the Second World War, so India, Burma, and Southeast Asia. And I've never seen a game set in, say, Burma or on the Indian-Burma border in the Second World War. That story is I've never seen that story told, for example. You know, so there is a huge there are swathes of subject matter that simply aren't touched, either for want of imagination or I think there is an understand or the kind of risk aversion of the major publishers who kind of set the weather, who kind of make the weather, if you see what I mean. I think there is, naturally you would need to come up with compelling game concepts that might explore what it was like to be a civilian war worker, or there are ideas I have in the back of my head based on some things in the museum's collection, but it would take a certain amount of boldness and vision, to realize, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah,
yeah.
I think on top, that's a good point. Like, it's usually focusing of a very specific experience, and is not even touching the majority of the histories in such conflicts. I would say that what tends to happen in video games, the historical interpretations, is that they are not giving you the context, what happened before, what happened after. Like, it is the event, it is the Civil War, it is the Second World War. It chooses some of those episodes because it has to tell you a story, but it kind of, the status quo in which you start, it kind of sprout out of nowhere, and you are just there. And if it's a war game in which you are a soldier, or you are the commander of your units, you just have to do those actions, and the only ethical questions that can happen there and might be interesting to play with, because there is no past from that present of the game, is the choices at the minute, the choices in the conflict, right? But it is not the thing. I focus on what I'm focusing because this is what I'm dealing with nowadays, right? But the thing with the Civil War is that the general memory of it is that it was a war between brothers, right? And to some point, it leads constantly to the equidistant reading of history, and one won, and it was sad, but why did the fascists take over? Why did they do a coup d'etat? Why? What happened before? What happened before the Republic? And then you're playing with those, even those blue and red soldiers, right? In the game, have a different identity just because you give them the context of their present that you are playing. And I'm missing that a lot in games. I'm missing material context for what's going on, except for a fun interaction with maybe the sporadic, very informative events of the present of the game.
I think a slightly less practical, maybe more academic response to the question of what is forgotten in the production process of games, I think, is the production itself. And I think it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier with the case study of Tackle Us the Heart of the Matter. But one of the things that has kind of come out of us working with Yar about that game, it's this idea of having games workshops with students where we kind of say, okay, do you think a game, say, about the Holocaust is a good idea? And then obviously they're all going to, tentatively say yes or no. And the idea would then be, okay, you need to design the game under this amount of time. And they have to kind of, think about the choices and limitations of that game design. But it's all just a cognitive exercise, essentially, that really just requires their imagination. But actually, there's play in the production. And I think that often gets kind of set aside. And whether or not this turns into a game that they create or not, there's still something valuable to do with memory practice and to do with play in itself and imaginative investment in the kind of mechanics of video game play, just in the design. So I think actually what gets left out is actually, the value of memory practice in the production and development stage before we've even got to the kind of end product. But I realize that's because I don't actually make games myself. So this is a kind of, fluffy answer to the question.
I'm reminded actually, Kate, that in 11/11 Memories Retold, when you get to the end credits, each of the members of the cast, each of the members of the crew were invited to nominate the person they were remembering, and so the production of the game became an opportunity for the game's crew to find their stories of their grandparents, their great grandparents, and name them. And so I think that idea of actually, I think partly, of course, that's fostered by the tone and the nature and the the aesthetics of the game. It feels like an appropriate thing for a game like that to do. It would feel oddly out of place, I think, in some more rip-roaring blockbuster game. But I think the point that making the game itself can be an act of remembrance is a powerful one. I'm reminded also of a game which I wanted to feature but in the end couldn't, called Bomber Crew, which was designed by a company called Run a Duck, an indie game, which starts with the opening screen is a takeoff of the Bomber Command Memorial on Piccadilly, and was in part inspired by the fact that one of the developers' great uncles was a bomber crewman who died in a flying accident in 1941. And so there's an element of again, the game itself was an act of remembrance.
Mm.
Okay. Thank you so much, everyone, so far. This finishes the first part of the panel, and we're moving on to the more open Q&A now. So for you in the audience, if you have any questions you want to ask our wonderful panelists, please put them in the chat. And I'll have a quick look what first questions you might have in the chat. Okay. First question from Timothy Peacock. In what ways can games that engage with memories of the same events from multiple different perspectives potentially reframe the ways in which we engage with a memory in history in games?
I could offer another more concrete example again, which hopefully will come out of the interview blog post, which is going to be uploaded shortly. But the game I mentioned, Remember, the Children of Bullenhauser Dam, is still currently in development, but the idea is kind of based in the 1970s. So the game itself is already thinking about commemoration culture of what happened during the Holocaust itself. So they've actually set the narrative at a time when there's specific things going on about remembering the event rather than placing it within the event. And the idea is that there's kind of 5 chapters and 5 characters, and each of them come from a completely different, I guess, form of national memory or position. So you might have someone who's 3rd generation, whose grandma experienced the Holocaust. You might have someone coming kind of as an immigrant into a country who's then kind of engaging with national discourses. You kind of have someone who is representative of the German memory politics of the time in the 70s. So I think that's quite an interesting approach, and to think about actually not setting things particularly at the time of the war, but actually in a period where there's a specific commemorative culture happening. Don't know if that answered the question directly, but.
Thank you.
And I am trying to think of a concrete example in which a game has done that kind of multiple perspective. You use the word, Tim, Rashomon-esque, memory of the same event, and I can't think of one that I've played myself. But I wonder whether people have, games they can nominate for that, because I can see how it might be done, but I don't think I've seen it done myself.
I can only think of fiction, completely science fiction examples. So it's not. I recently played Nier Automata, which has nothing to do or a lot to do with this, because it's again talks about war, but it's a fantastic, flamboyant sci-fi with pretty outfits. But it is a game that is it is a story that you played 3 times. It has 26 endings, but only 3 that are important anyways, to understand what the game is trying to tell you. I'm a completionist, and I'm close to finishing those 20. That's another story. The thing is that it does play with something that would be very interesting for this medium, which is that the player can do contradictions in the story depending on the character that they are playing, and all of them are stories that happen in the game. That could be something to explore, but again, what are those affordances and what are the risk of the stories that you are telling in each of them. So it's not only to the point that you are telling episodic histories of different families or different characters, but that they actually contradict the memory of each of those in a way that it's either or somewhere in between. But that is something very sensitive for the matter of bellic history, especially, and the dramatic events of our societies. But to be honest, it's an interesting narrative device in game mechanics that you can, as a player, contradict what you just played just by playing another character.
Thank you. Unless Ian looks like he wants to. Ian is muted. Okay.
I was just, I mean, actually, just a game that has sprung to mind actually in connection with this current line of conversation was Return of the Obra Dinn. A detective game where you explore a very tangled, narrative of what happened to the crew of a ship by freezing time and exploring snippets of scenery. And it bit me so hard. I played it. I had to finish it to the nth degree because it was just so compelling. But this idea of how one might explore a real historical event from multiple perspectives, I think the risk would be that you might wind up turning it into a detective story, and that there would be a fixed, final, complete, true story at the bottom of it, which you could get to the bottom of it if you 100%ed the game. And I think actually in history terms, that would probably be an undesirable outcome, simply because for so much of what we deal with, it's not so possible to be 100% certain that a certain event played out a certain way. It's just in the nature of historical practice, I think, that usually we can't get that degree of certainty. So, thank you.
Thanks.
Just as one tiny little add-on point as well, another thing that the game I previously mentioned, The Children of Bullerhausen Down, which is interesting in this regard, is it does have those kind of contradictory narratives, but it also has it uses game mechanics to present memories that are kind of fuzzy or difficult or not straightforward, in ways that aren't questioning, say, testimony, but in ways that kind of deal with the nature of memory itself. But then you also have figures that are kind of historians or librarians that seem to have this kind of I don't know, I guess, academic stance on a history, but neither are privileged. And I think that's another thing we'd have to be really kind of careful of, is not to kind of have a hierarchy of information which kind of dictates what is history and what is memory. And I think that game is starting to ask really interesting questions about sources of historical knowledge and where the line is between memories in really interesting ways. And I think games could definitely capitalize on that more.
Right. Thank you. I think we're going to move on to the next question, unless any of the panelists have something else they would like to add. No, right. Okay. So, question two from Kate Cook: if there is a tomb in a game for a real world historical figure, but you meet that figure in the game, does a tomb within the game commemorate the real figure, or just commemorate the fictional character? For example, Leonidas in Assassin's Creed Odyssey. Can historical games ever avoid this issue, which might be particularly problematic for modern figures, of course?
Well, when that question has turned my brain into spaghetti, but I think, I don't know, my first instinct is that, like Las Vegas, what happens in the game world stays in the game world. So the Leonidas tomb that you encounter must surely be the tomb of the fictional Leonidas who you've just met. I think otherwise you wind up surely in some sort of metatextual spaghetti knot, which I don't think I can begin to untangle. Sorry, I think I have to give way at that point. I don't think I can. I think this kind of knot is not going to budge. I wonder what my fellow panelists think.
Worries. Do any of the other two panelists want to talk about the difference between, obviously, historical figures in games and commemorating them potentially in game versus, is this still about the digital copy, or is that representation of somebody, or do you think it's actually more seriously about the actual existing person, and all the knots in your brain that may come with it?
Again, yeah, like Nick said, you've broken our brains, Kate. I think maybe to kind of nuance the question a little bit, it would be interesting if the kind of avatar player relationship, so, you know, are we playing the historical figure, for example, and then maybe that kind of, you have I guess a critical distance in the sense that, you know, how are we being asked to engage with or identify with or perform this historical figure, and, you know, how am I guess I don't know, I always think about this kind of over identification and the risk of that if you're playing kind of in historical figures. And I think there's ways in which the game mechanics can kind of distance you from it. And I've spoken to people who think about, I guess, breaking the fourth wall, but in gameplay itself, and kind of turning the kind of lens back on your own choices and things like that. And maybe there's something there to kind of, if you're the player and you're playing historical figure, then you're kind of, you're you and you're them at the same time. I don't know. I'm kind of, it's not really an answer, but I'm just filling the.
I think I'd like to say that if Gandhi in Civilization threatens me with a nuke, I'd like to feel okay by nuking him back without having to feel like feeling like I've nuked actual Gandhi, if that's okay, I think.
Yeah, it is the figure and the real person. They are attached to each other, but at the same time they are two different identities, right? So it has to, it requires the agreement, unspoken agreement of the player or the audience to engage in this particular piece, as it is fiction, or it's partially fiction, but it's based on the quirks that the character was reported to have, and it was interesting to portray them in that way, or the creators of that story with that character are making up a completely different archetype because they need it for the storytelling. Yeah, well, sometimes the person behind will be stronger than the figure, whatever you're doing, but sometimes the representation is the only, or the representation in your piece of media is going to be the only relationship that the player has with the actual person, and they will more potentially take it that as more true to what it was. So I just hope that if my game ever gets finished and gets published, that on one hand people will understand some of the references, on the other that they will have the support for external support for understanding more beyond what can be contained in it. That is also the risk of making games with actual people. And
just to follow up to that, I think Kate added a kind of follow up to her question. I don't know if you can see it, Hanne, but just saying here, I guess my question is, if we're talking about commemoration, that games simultaneously represent historical events and figures, can games legitimately commemorate something real and not something fictionalized? So I think actually my take on the original question would be yes, because I think actually commemoration is probably, the onus is on me, and the commemoration is about my memory practice. And so if I believe that games are a form of memory practice, then I think it's a legitimate form of memory practice. And I wouldn't distinguish between, say, for example, creating or playing a game to going out and standing in a moment's silence for said real or fictionalized figure. So actually, yes, I would say it can, because I think it's down to the person, and we have to believe that that's a form of memory practice that isn't lesser to our kind of traditional forms of memory practice for the historical figure.
Okay, thank you. I think we're going to move on to the next question in that case. Okay. Silence, wonderful. Okay, so we did have a question about the current situation in Palestine. However, it is obviously a very tremendous difficult subject at the moment, but we cannot, well, directly cover it in this format. For obvious reason, it's an ongoing conflict. However, the core of the question, though, is quite interesting. It's about trauma and memory, and and we are aware of how immediate the discussion of how memory comes to this point, obviously, with what is happening. So the question itself is, apologies, how do we reconcile the potential for games to commemorate events in the future with a sense of what it means to be within those incredibly painful events, to witness them directly today, basically? And I'd like to start this question with Kate, especially on the topic of Holocaust.
Sorry, can you repeat the question? I was sort of lost.
Apologies. So it's more about how do we reconcile the potential, well, that a future game might commemorate something that we are living through right now, in a way, especially if we're talking about particular painful events.
I guess my initial response would be kind of what I was sort of hinting at in my previous answer, is to maybe not see games as such a radical form of commemoration, and actually to think that, you know, we already engage in many kind of different forms of memory practice and commemoration, and actually maybe they're not so so far removed from things that we already do. I'm thinking I guess more at the moment about an AR project that's coming to mind. But for example, it was seen as quite radical. It was a project in the Dachau concentration camp. It was called The Liberation, and you could go into the camp and use your smartphone to superimpose historical photographs back into the setting of the camp. And I think some people saw this as a really radical project, but actually what you're doing is you're walking, you're talking, and you're engaging in photographic practices. So I think there's something there also to think about with games, is that like they're always seen as this kind of new and novel form of, in the heritage sector at least, or in this memory space today, we're talking about the potential for it, but actually maybe it's not so radical, and maybe the things we're doing in games is already linked to kind of commemorative practices. So I'm not sure if that answers in terms of future games and anticipating kind of current conflicts and witnessing, but I think that it, you know, there wouldn't be such a kind of hesitation around those. I'll think a bit more for a better answer.
Well, thank you so far. Casilda, same question, but the focus on the Spanish Civil War. I mean, you mentioned that it obviously the people that Wissingers and were actually alive back in the day are now quite senior.
Yes and no, because after the war there was plenty of time for more generations to be born and still exist nowadays. My parents remember the Franco times, right? It is present, not in the way of, I think it's a little bit different with Germany, because, well, different bands won with different outcomes as well. Spain was not divided into half, it was just solidified into a monolithic Christofascist autarky. But the thing is that it is a very present memory. I did not leave the prosecution of the state for not aligning with the ideals of God and Spain, but it is in the living memory of my very living family. And part of touching this project and creating it is in a way, it is a therapeutic way or a grieving way for me to artistically, creatively put order in my head of the past of my past. Even if I was not born, I live the consequences in the 90s, in the 2000s, in the present time of the past of the place I was born in and I grew up in. I would say that in 50 years, something else is being made by the conflicts of the present, and it will still be made by people that are grieving, if not from personal experience, from their family experience, from the experience of reading what happened, or hopefully not forgetting the past. But I would say that even nowadays it would be important that people are making their own therapeutic creations. I think games are also very useful for creative writing, right? And it's just to put together things, and you don't need to publish it, and it's fine. It's your creation. It's your thoughts, just in an interactive manner. I would like to see that games are not only taken as the fantastic, spectacular, or the serious, very well-funded, self-contained objects, but I desire for everyone to be able to have the space to create things, and if it's through games, then it should be through games, and there will be grief in them, and there will be nasty things happening in those pieces of media, but it is the personal experience, and in 50 years it will be the personal experience from hearing it at home, from living it, because that doesn't live in that's not forgotten in 5 years. That's not, the pandemic is still with us, right?
I think for my part, naturally, inevitably, the thought that somebody might commemorate you in the future in some way or another is no comfort if you're living under bombing or other violence. However, I don't, and I can't imagine, for instance, that a soldier climbing out of his trench in the First World War would be comforted very much to know that in 2023 poppies would be sold to commemorate his death on the Somme, for instance. That said, I think commemorative practices of all kinds are they're one of our human drives. We have a human drive to remember what went before, and to come together to process collective grief and collective trauma. And I think it's probably inevitable that some of that will manifest itself in virtual spaces. It will be no comfort to anyone currently faced by any form of military or terrorist violence. But I think I would hope that offence would not be taken, that people will in the future remember in their own way. I think that's about as much as I can safely comment on that particular subject, but thank you for the question.
Thank you. Okay, do you still want to add something, or shall we move on to the next question?
No, I think we're good.
Excellent. Okay. So our next question is from Chris Camshell. And he asked, to what extent do games suffer from a problem of terminology that hits them harder than other media? We slightly covered it as well already. So for his example is entertainment taken to mean fun, and serious mean sad. This is similar to how hard it is to talk about Schindler's List as an entertaining, a gripping, a powerful film. And it won loads of awards at the same time. But for games, the whole medium is tied to fun and entertainment. Is that a barrier to seriousness, in your opinions?
I would just say, specifically because that was referring to the Holocaustist theme and topic, that there is some kind of weird, palpable sense that games get it the worst, actually, in this field. And, we work in the field of digital Holocaust memory, and it seems that heritage professionals and kind of institutions and memorial sites find it easier and more palpable to work in sort of mediums of augmented reality, virtual reality projects, even, the interactive 3D testimonies that people know as kind of holograms. These were seen as kind of appropriate and innovative forms in which to preserve and to digitize, but games hadn't been until very recently. But even then, actually, I think, and this I think is actually a good thing, is that game designers are being taken seriously in relation to these spaces. And I think that should be across all forms. But there seems to be a hesitancy within the sector more generally to take on games. And I think there was, very much once this idea of a kind of limit of representation or hesitation around the kind of ethics of Holocaust cinema. It's been well written about, and I think that now this kind of taboo around that has moved on to games specifically. So yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, Chris. Nice to know you're here. I think it's a really interesting question, and I think it is the part of this is as we've discussed, I think a terminological thing. It's the binding up of games with fun. Games are fun almost by definition. Schindler's List is a film that you go, you don't. One likes to think that you don't walk into Schindler's List armed with a big bag of popcorn and expect to have a whale of a time. It's a film that you go to experience and to feel something. And I think actually games should also be a medium which you engage with in order to feel something. That feeling might be joy. It might be the joy of spanking somebody in some multiplayer shooter, but it could also be a moment of deep empathy. And I think. When I'm conscious, for example, of a game like this War of Mine, a game which I have racked up a fair few hours with, and I'm not 100% sure I ever really enjoyed, because it was just a relentlessly bleak experience where one felt one was constantly up against it. Yes, I'm also reminded that on the exhibition that we made together, Chris, talking to Brenda Romero, she described a game called That Dragon Cancer, a game about the experience of a parent's young child dying of a childhood cancer. She described it as the Mona Lisa of game design because it moved her so deeply that she found herself stroking the screen of her phone to try and comfort the baby she saw or the child she saw on screen. So it's well within the capability of games to make us feel profound human emotions, and I think it's and I think if you're the baggage that goes with entertainment is, I think, rapidly becoming a hindrance to, I think, creatively and artistically and socially important projects that games can and should be engaging with.
Thank you. Kathy, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, to be honest, animation still gets that, and it's older than cinema. So I don't know, it might have to do with the fact that people need to draw the characters or model them in order to make them appear in the screen that pushes the narrative. I'm joking here. It's gonna be there for a while. It's just that Dragon Cancer is a really nice, really good game. Can games move us? Yes, because it's another medium and it can tell us things through its nature, which it also contains other mediums, and it's fantastic, and you can play with that as a creator. And then there should be a space for all of this. The thing is, one part is the wishful thinking, the potential of games as a medium of expression, the potential of reaching out, and then the material conditions in which these games can have to be made, or any if the attention is towards the production of certain kind of already pre-established, more banal or more less risky projects, because they are also big games are very expensive to produce, then they are not going to be the ones that, I assume, they're not going to be the ones that are trying to tell you something different. Smaller budget ones, they can be as banal, because why not? But also, the risk is lower, and therefore I'm being very specific with the economical conditions, because it does say if something happens or not. As a medium in itself, let's hypothesize that you have all the all the elements necessary for producing something. Then you create it as you will. But the reality is that you have this amount of time with this amount of people that will have that amount of time, and you will need money for that, either for feeding yourself by working for others and then doing this in your free time, or finally funneling some money from other places, from cultural heritage projects, fundings and stuff like that. So it's like we could create War and Peace. We could create, right, magnificent pieces of work, of gigantic, massive productions, the latest Scorsese in games kind of situation. But the reality or where the money is going is not there. And therefore we don't have a latest Scorsese made into a film kind of games. I think that is my reading as someone struggling to make the things that I want and working very nicely. And I love my people. I love the projects I'm working on, but working for others, right? To do
it's
those
funny.
things.
As you were speaking, I was thinking very much about the process of exhibition making, and the process of exhibition making is so contingent on, can you get the funding? Does the architectural space allow you to do a certain thing? Is there a showcase available for the object you want? Have you got an object in your collection that tells the story you want to tell? And if not, you make do. And I think a good exhibition that you can open and a good game that you can play will always be better than a perfect game that you can't deliver or a perfect exhibition that you can't visit. And I think that there is so much. There's a risk, I think, sometimes of getting a bit sort of what's the word, puritanical or purist or sort of seeking for the perfect manifestation of a tasteful commemorative discourse in whatever the one game might be. And actually, this is all still an experimental field. And I think a good, honest attempt at whatever the challenge might be within the resources that you have available to you will always be a greater contribution to the field than having a lofty idea about something which you can never build.
Yeah.
That's probably the hands-on curatory person part of me getting his day out. But anyway, thank you.
Thank you, Ian. So unfortunately, we're running out of time for further questions, even though we do have some really interesting ones in the chat. And thank you, everybody, for engaging and posting and commenting on things. So before we are closing, I would just like to go back to our panelists and maybe ask for a last, comment or takeaway they would like to give us as the audience on the topic. Before we're finishing for today.
I guess I can jump in because it really follows on from what Ian just said perfectly, actually. One of the takeaways from our report that I've referred to throughout the discussion was actually that people agreed it was better to take the risk. And actually, this is a trial and error process, and all of these people need to come together in the production and design process and actually to work with everyone at the same level of respect. So you have your historians, your game developers, your heritage professionals, and we're better to come together at the production process from the start and take the risk. And that, may take a lot of courage. And we may make mistakes along the way, but the general consensus was that, it's better to start and to do these things than, like you say, to have a lofty idea and never follow them through. So that's my final comment.
Thank you, Kate. Nancy, Ian, who wants to go next?
I'm struggling to think of a neat summing up. I mean, I suppose I'm struck that, to some large extent, the memory is something which you can't really isolate it. It's not something that you can detach yourself from or divorce yourself from or operate, in a vacuum of. It's in some way, it's the sea in which we all swim. And it's, I suppose the trick is noticing that it's there, that it's moving in certain directions or other directions, and being conscious of the current that's flowing, and diverting it to a thought-provoking or interesting end. I mean, more than anything, I'm interested to see Cassie's game when it eventually comes along. I can't wait to get my hands on it. I guess.
No pressure, huh? Eventually. Can't make promises, but the final words would be: I wish there were more people, at least in the open, trying to do specifically games about or around as a historical background the Spanish Civil War, and I would really like to see especially the ones that are not about it, but it just happens to be in that context, in the realms of what Guillermo del Toro does with, well, the Fascio Italy with Pinocchio and Pan's Labyrinth, that is the north of Spain, during the, if not the Civil War, the beginning of the dictatorship, and because it's just the background that is like it's invisible. It's never, it's not there as present. That memory is completely contingent in an amnesty law from the 70s, and it kind of got put everything, hid everything. And it's not that a single game should give all the answers, but I would love to see more of this. So maybe one does something that someone deems that it's very important and interesting, and we can continue growing as a medium. There is this thing that if a film in Spain is about the Civil War, it will get nominated to the national to the National Academy Awards, the Goya. So people are experimenting with that topic and talking about that topic through other mediums, and it's not happening in video games. And I would like a little bit less pressure on my shoulders, to be honest. So if I do it wrong, well, at least you know you have these 5 examples of much better understanding of this so completely complicated and grieving and never went past that kind of situation. So yeah, please make games, everyone.
Yes, please. Okay, so this brings us to the end of today's panel. Thank you so much for our wonderful panelists for joining us today, for answering all our questions. Thank you for everybody in the audience. Thanks for your questions, and I hope to see you at the next panel, which I'm not quite sure what it will be about, but it will be very interesting. Sure. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.